The relationship between the United States and China has become a hot topic lately, with many debating whether there's a need for further engagement between the two countries. In interpersonal relationships, if someone lacks integrity, we might end ties. However, the dynamics between nations cannot simply mirror the patterns of personal interactions. Throughout history, even in times of war between nations, there has always been a channel for diplomatic missions, crucial for negotiation and communication between conflicting parties to quell hostilities. China and the U.S. are strategic competitors. China knows that the U.S. isn't entirely trustworthy, so why engage in talks with them? In reality, the foundation between nations isn't built on trust but on mutual interests. In this video, we'll focus on the China-U.S. relationship and the upcoming summit in San Francisco, discussing why China and the U.S. are engaging in talks, key events of the past year, what the U.S. expects from China, understanding each other's strategies in negotiations. If trust were the sole criterion for engagement, there might indeed be no necessity for discussions between China and the U.S. However, when it comes to assessing and exchanging interests, except in cases of direct conflict, negotiation remains crucial between the two nations. So, when Chinese leaders head to San Francisco to meet with the U.S. president, it's not about making peace but about negotiating. This understanding clarifies why we engage with the United States. Sincerity is like a soap bubble easily burst. It's interests that reign supreme, the guiding principle in interactions between all nations. Regarding the China-U.S. relationship, there wasn't an overly optimistic outlook to begin with. As officially stated, stability suffices in China-U.S. relations. A commentary in the People's Daily on October 31 stated that both sides should adhere to the principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and win-win cooperation. Building upon the consensus reached at the Bali summit between the leaders of both countries, efforts should be made to stabilize and steer China-U.S. relations back onto a healthy and stable development track. What constitutes stability? It's maintaining the status quo, with the primary goal being to avoid direct military conflict. Other aspects where consensus can be reached are favorable, but if not, it's acceptable. President Biden had previously mentioned that the main aim of this summit is to establish military communication between China and the U.S., preventing strategic misjudgments. White House National Security Advisor Sullivan also remarked that despite inherent competition and ongoing tensions, if both countries focus on core practical issues, they really can establish a stable relationship. Sullivan further stated that the U.S. will inevitably coexist with China indefinitely, which will characterize the future international landscape. Coexistence with major powers will be a fundamental strategic premise for U.S. policy. Seeking common ground while reserving differences has long been a crucial diplomatic approach for China. Seeking common ground means finding the most agreeable aspects. For instance, in this recent summit, the first agreement reached was on climate issues, as there were minimal disagreements between the two sides. Reserving differences allows for acknowledging areas of conflicting interests. If negotiation can align these conflicting interests toward common gains, that's ideal. If not, the differences are acknowledged without fixating on them. Some argue that China engaging with the U.S. again is merely a ploy by White House politicians, leveraging diplomacy for the 2024 elections. Once their goals are met, China might be sidelined again. However, China's expectations remain modest. As mentioned earlier, as long as stability is maintained between China and the U.S., preserving the status quo suffices. From Bali to San Francisco, a year later, the leaders of China and the U.S. once again meet in person. What has happened this year? Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, the balloon incident, which brought Sino-U.S. relations to a freezing point, leading to a comprehensive halt in communication and dialogue between the two countries. It wasn't until mid-year when high-ranking U.S. officials represented by Secretary of State Blinken broke the deadlock with consecutive visits to China. Biden even dispatched his right-hand man, Senate Majority Leader Schumer and California Governor Newsom, extending an invitation to China. With Chinese officials laying the groundwork in return, this paved the way for the summit between the leaders of China and the U.S. In preparation for the visit of the Chinese leadership, the host city of the APEC summit, San Francisco, engaged in a surprising image overhaul, including actions like clearing out homeless people and tidying up streets. At least this time, the U.S. adopted a more accommodating stance, sincerely welcoming the Chinese leadership. The Bali Consensus sets the bottom line for negotiations between China and the U.S., serving as the foundation for the San Francisco summit. As articulated by President Biden, the U.S. doesn't seek to alter China's system, initiate a new Cold War, or provoke conflict by bolstering ally relations. They oppose antagonizing China, do not support Taiwan independence, nor endorse a two Chinas or a one China, one Taiwan stance, with no intention to engage in conflict with China. For this meeting between the Chinese leadership and President Biden in San Francisco, Biden must return to the Bali Consensus to potentially achieve substantial outcomes at the summit. As long as the U.S. doesn't cross China's bottom line regarding the Taiwan issue, there is room to negotiate on all other matters. What troubles has the U.S. encountered this year? Domestically, high inflation, a debt crisis, and the impending start of the 2024 presidential election. Internationally, escalating conflicts in the Middle East involving the U.S., coupled with the Russia-Ukraine war, have left the U.S. in a dilemma of multiple fronts. What does the U.S. hope China will assist with? Expanding exports to allow more competitively priced Chinese manufactured goods into the U.S., aiding in controlling high inflation. Delaying the reduction of holdings in U.S. bonds, and if possible, further increasing these holdings to prevent a government debt crisis. Frequent diplomatic interactions between China and the U.S. to support Biden's 2024 presidential election, particularly if it leads to reciprocal visits between the leaders, which could boost Biden's popularity. Stabilizing the situation in the Taiwan Strait, maintaining peace there to alleviate pressure for the U.S. in the Russia-Ukraine and Middle Eastern battlefields. Will China assist the U.S. with these matters? Again, seeking common ground while preserving differences. Actions speak louder than words. Talk may come first, but substantive benefits require evidence of change and sincerity from the U.S. For consideration, Sino-U.S. economic and trade relations offer negotiation and collaboration opportunities in numerous industries and sectors. For instance, purchasing U.S. soybeans or a few Boeing airplanes are viable options. However, barriers in economic and trade relations are mutual. If the U.S. aims to constrain China in the technology sector, China will make it challenging for the U.S. in the supply of rare metals. In essence, China won't readily concede to what the U.S. desires, it's a matter of reciprocal concessions. The exchange of benefits must be equitable. In reality, not only does China not hold any expectations for U.S. trustworthiness, but the U.S.'s expectations regarding what China can help with are also remarkably low. Both sides understand each other's temperament and bottom lines quite clearly. Following a series of clashes after the Bali summit, China won't easily trust the U.S., and the U.S. will struggle to deceive China. Since both sides know each other's bottom lines, why engage in talks? Because it's crucial to prevent strategic misjudgments and avoid direct conflicts. The consequences of a Cold War result in deepening estrangement between both sides. Without timely communication and resolution, the situation might escalate toward a hot war. Therefore, as Biden has made clear, there's a strong desire to maintain dialogue and communication with China, especially in the military domain. For China and the U.S., avoiding a hot war is the primary goal, the ultimate bottom line. As for other aspects, reaching agreements is preferable, but if not, leaving them aside is acceptable. How Taiwan's issue is handled determines whether direct conflict might arise between China and the U.S. Hence, we insist that the U.S. must return to the Bali Consensus and refrain from supporting Taiwan independence. If Biden reiterates the Bali Consensus, the relationship between China and the U.S. would stabilize. It aligns with both the U.S.'s objectives and China's expectations. Compared to the Bali summit, the expectations for the San Francisco summit are low not only between Chinese and American officials but also among the citizens of both countries in terms of restoring Sino-U.S. relations. Paradoxically, this might facilitate substantive outcomes in discussions between the two nations. In the future, discussions and actions will set the new rhythm in managing bilateral relations between China and the U.S. Currently, the U.S. is in a politically tumultuous period preceding elections. Engaging more with the U.S. is beneficial for China to grasp the domestic situation, preparing for research and responses ahead. Engagement in talks doesn't imply concessions, it's about enhancing communication between both sides to prevent increased estrangement, which could lead to an uncontrollable state in bilateral relations. Therefore, dialogue is necessary. The U.S. doesn't seek to change China, and China doesn't seek to influence the U.S. As long as both sides coexist peacefully, it's already an ideal scenario.